Welcome to your Wired Fitness podcast, where we talk about everything related to ADHD and neurodiversity. My name's Kevin, and today what I'm going to talk about is this article that I found that says they know ADHD presents in different forms, but scientists cannot explain it. They don't understand or don't fully understand how ADHD comes in these different forms or different types, but I'm really interested in what they're looking at and how we can really figure out what's going on with ADHD in the future and all the technology that we have and how that technology is going to help us, such as 3D modeling and things of that nature. So stick around and I'll talk about all of that as I go through the article. Now, if you like these videos, if you like the podcast, go ahead and press the subscribe button if you're on YouTube and press the notification bell so you can be notified every time I put out a new video. Also, leave a like, leave a comment. Okay, let's get into it. Now, I find it so interesting that we have had ADHD around and they have studied ADHD for a long time. And I'm also interested in what are they looking at in the brain? Like what sections, what experiments, and that's just me. I love learning things about the brain and all the different things and trying to figure out things. And maybe that's you as well. But the thing about it is that through all this, through all the imaging, through all the experiments, through all the theories, everything, scientists still don't understand it. They cannot fully explain it. They might have some explanations, they might have some theories about this section or that section of the brain, but they cannot fully explain it. So that just comes to show that if you can't explain ADHD, if you don't have any idea, if you're having trouble coming up with the words to explain it, don't feel bad because scientists can't explain it either. It's just complex. ADHD is just complex. They are still looking at things, they're still discovering things, they're still saying, oh, we discovered this and we discovered that. So don't feel bad if you can't explain it. Do your best. Try to explain it if you can. Try to explain what you go through. And I think it's more about just working together with psychologists, scientists, psychiatrists, and just the ADHD community as a whole to figure this thing out. Okay, let's dive in. The first thing that I want to say is this, and this is what the article goes over really first, is that brain imaging scan. And whenever you have a brain imaging scan, if you don't know that what a brain imaging scan is, very simple. It's an image scan of your brain, and they use them to see what's going on in your brain when you have a mental health issue or mental disorder, right? They go through and look at what sections pop off in the brain, what sections light up, what sections don't light up. And so you can see the different colors and see which parts of the brain are active and which parts of the brain are not active. And so it's really interesting. Like, you ever get a chance, go and just look at some brain imaging scans. And yeah, okay, maybe that's the nerd in me that, hey, I like to look at stuff like that. But it's still interesting because of all these different colors and all these different things. You really learn a lot about it. I don't know if you want to read through all the different things they found out because maybe that might be boring. I'm not sure. But anyway, it's still interesting to look at. And so in these imaging studies, they found that certain parts of the brain or certain sections of the brain associated with ADHD are smaller. And the article says right here, in recent years, imaging studies have revealed size differences in certain parts of the brain associated with ADHD. Researchers think that disrupted connectivity in the brain might be another neurological manifestation of the disorder. Now, it goes on to say that growing evidence from brain imaging studies may help better reconceptualize ADHD by linking brain-based features with improved clinical care models and treatment outcomes. And so right there, you'll see that they are looking at different models, different things that they can look at your brain and say, okay, this might be the reason. This might be what's going on. And so they keep looking at these imaging studies, keep getting more information. But yet they still are unable to figure out, they still are unable to classify everything associated with ADHD. And so I think that's interesting because they have done so many experiments. They have seen that certain parts are smaller when associated with ADHD. Now, I'm thinking this too, is that, and just this is just my opinion, they've done enough studies to conclude this, right? But as with everything, maybe some people don't have these smaller sections still have ADHD because of the fact they can't account for everyone. They're only accounting for the study that they did and the sample that they had. So just think about it that way too. Maybe there are some people out there that don't have these smaller sections that also have ADHD, and then that would open up a lot more to look at and think about. And so I think it's going to be an ever evolving thing to figure out, okay, what's going on. We're doing these imaging studies, and now we found this out and this out, and now we have to look at something else. I think it's gone through that process through all the time of looking at things for ADHD. Now, the article also continues, says the latest study, which looked at white matter parts of the brain, didn't observe any structural differences associated with ADHD. There you go. This is not a setback, as the findings represent a sustained effort from researchers to recognize and understand brain features underpinning ADHD. So, looking at this again, as you go through the article, you're seeing, okay, yeah, they look at this and say, hey, we found that these sections are smaller, but then right below it's like no structural difference at all. So that's the thing. Like, you see some experiments, see some studies, and they say one thing, but then you also see the other side of it where they say, nope, that's not true, or that's at least not what we found. And so how do you understand something where you have two opposing kind of information and really trying to put things together? And that may be why they can't fully understand how ADHD is and how ADHD comes about. Again, the article says this. It says ADHD is a common but complex neurobehavioral disorder that emerges as patterns of inattentive impulse and sometimes hyperactivity behavior. The next part of the article goes into neurodiversity, and I think is really interesting because it says even though the exact cause of ADHD remains unclear, the neuroscientists have demonstrated in some studies that ADHD stems from underlying neurological differences. Without understanding these differences, we risk condemning ADHD as bad behavior instead of acknowledging it for what it is, another form of neurodiversity where people's brains seem to be wired to work another way. Now, people just understood that would just decrease stigma so much because a lot of times people with ADHD are just misunderstood. And because of the fact everyone sees it as a bad kind of behavior and they can't do this, they can't do that, they can't succeed or whatever, right? But if people just understood the way someone with ADHD thinks, then it might just be more like, oh, you have ADHD? Okay, let's work together. I understand a little bit about how you think, but tell me more. And this is kind of how the way I think, and let's just work together. And you have this like at jobs, right? You have somebody that's good at one thing, somebody's good at another thing, and you work together and you accomplish things. You don't automatically look at a person and say, oh, we know that you're bad at this, or we know that you're bad at that, or we know that you can't work together because of this certain thing that we know, right? That's usually not how it works. You usually say, hey, I am going to take this part of the project because I know I'm good at that, and you take this part of the project because I know we discussed it. I know you're good at this, and we work together and come up with the most amazing things. We accomplish so much more together. So people just understood and didn't have this huge stigma about ADHD, then they would be able to look at it and say, oh, you think differently. What are you good at? Oh, you're good at this. Okay, that makes sense because I've heard about ADHD that, you think differently, and this might be an area where you have a strength, and now you've kind of confirmed that. Awesome, let's work together. Oh, you have an issue with this, but you are amazing at this. Awesome, let's work together. And it's just about working together. If we can just get to a point where we work together, there's not stigma between, people with ADHD, and stigma about ADHD is what I mean. And then really trying to figure out, okay, well, how do we discuss this without having that stigma, right? Then that would be amazing. Just to not have the stigma would be amazing. Okay, let's look at something else. As a previous research from 2017 found brain differences related to ADHD that were small but clearly evident among 1,700 children and adults with ADHD and 1,500 people without ADHD. Okay, so the thing about it is it's a small difference. So does a small difference really matter hugely, right? A small difference is just small. So when you think about that, you're like, okay, well, just a small difference. But why does it affect me in this way? Why do I think this way? Why do I think differently? Just because of the small difference? I don't think scientists know. I don't think they have figured it out yet. They understand it's clear, it's evident, it is very small, but why does it affect the way you think? Why does it affect that you think differently? Why does someone without this difference think differently in this way? I thought it was really interesting just to see that, hey, it's not something that's in your brain that's this huge thing, that's this huge difference between one and the other. It's a very, very small difference. So I thought that was something that was interesting to know just looking at this study from 2017. And look, honestly, they did an experiment of 3,200 people, so maybe they do another experiment, another 3,200 people that may be different. They may find, oh, there's no difference, So you don't know really because you're taking a sample, or they're taking a sample of 3,200 people, and there are over 300 million people in the United States, or if you're around the world, there might be more, right? More in wherever you live, or more or less, right? So when you're looking at this, okay, in these 3,200 people, this is evident, but is it evident in everyone? And I don't know. I don't think they know either because they're taking a sample. They have to take a sample because they can't obviously go to everyone in a country and say, hey, take this test, take part in this test, and then really find out. They have to take a sample. And I think it's significant what they found out. But if they test another 3,200 people, or did this experiment on another 3,200 people, would the result be the same? And look at something else. There was a study then where researchers looked at brain scans from 35 children and teenagers with ADHD and compared them to 28 so-called neurotypical controls. And they found using 3D modeling that there's no difference in the white matter of the brain, which is interesting because of the fact that you have someone with ADHD and you have someone that's neurotypical or doesn't have ADHD, you would think that if it was such a thing that, hey, you have this big difference, that there would be some difference in white matter, but it really isn't. So that's significant in itself. And it says on a structural level, the researcher could not find or could not observe any underlying differences in white matter that would differentiate the inattentive and combined subtypes from each other or separate the kids from ADHD from the unaffected controls. Now, I find that pretty awesome that there's no difference. I know it was a small experiment or a small study, but still really awesome that it came up with those results. And they say that this is not the first time they tested this. They have tested this before, and the results are the same. But they also say that more studies are warranted to really understand. But so far, all the tests they have done have come back with the same results. So I'm just going to say no difference. I don't know if they'll find a difference later. But as for right now, what they've determined is there's no difference between someone with ADHD in the white matter of the brain and someone without ADHD in the white matter of their brain. So I think that's really amazing. I think that's really awesome. I think it's worth being super happy about. Okay, it's a win for everyone with ADHD, I think. Now check this out. It says a person behavioral expression of ADHD might also change from time to time through their teen years and into adulthood, making ADHD subtypes a somewhat transient classification. And the article also says that we might want to look at functional measures of brain activity, which basically means we're going to look at the brain. We're going to look at the brain more instead of looking at the behavior as much. We're going to really dive into, okay, how the brain works, how the brain functions, instead of looking at the behavior that's represented and try to figure out ADHD from just the brain functions. And so I thought that was interesting because we've done so much research. ADHD has been around for such a long time. And now we're getting to the fact, okay, 3D modeling, spatial analysis, all this kind of stuff. And now we're going to look just at the brain functions instead of looking at the behavior. Now, one of the most interesting things I found is that they say that these behavioral types may not be consistent over time. And that's what I just read, the other quote. Now, the other thing they said, they might be better understand ADHD by functional brain types, which is really about, hey, we're going to look at the brain and try to understand it that way rather than look at behavior. Now, the last thing that I thought was awesome, well, kind of really interesting in the fact that they said there might be 7 different types of ADHD. So we have 3 now. We understand about 3 of them. But now there might be 4 more that we didn't even know existed until the researchers say, hey, there might be 7. And so are we going to have 7 in the future? Are we going to have 7 that are accepted in the future? And that's the case. And we really don't know that much about ADHD. We would have to figure out, okay, how do we determine what the other 4 are? How do we see, how are we studying the other 4? Now we have to study 7 instead of just 3. And so that is why ADHD is so complex. That now we have 3, but we could have 7. Or maybe it's 5, maybe it's 6. You never know. Or we don't know. And so just think about that. There could be 7 types. And that's just what the article says. That's what the researchers have researched. And I think it's really interesting. I think it's really kind of amazing to see that there are so many different things about ADHD that we don't know yet. We don't know where it comes from in the brain. We don't know how it kind of comes up. We don't know, what really affects it. We don't know, hey, what part of the brain is responsible for it? Because as we see, there's these slight differences. And in some cases, no difference at all between someone with ADHD and someone with the OWL. And so what do you think about all this information? What do you think about the article? I thought it was really interesting. I thought it was really eye-opening. Let me know what you think in the comments. I hope you have a great day, and I will talk to you later.
And it's a beautiful thing, too.